Good evening, everybody, for everyone joining us in the UK and Europe, and thanks everyone from around the world for joining. I thought I would start trying to do a couple more YouTube videos just in relation to live videos in relation to particular topical things that come up. And I don't think there's probably too many more topical issues at the moment, more so than what has effectively happened today. So the aim of the next 30 minutes or so is to give a little bit of detail as to what's happened, answer some questions as we go along, and provide a little bit of detail as to the significance and consequence for what has happened today. So yeah, as I mentioned, start sending on questions, things that you've got to think about, stuff that you want to hear discussed, and I'll do my absolute best to be able to answer all the questions as much as possible. And yeah, and thanks everyone for joining. So in brief, where are we? So this morning and even last week, it was announced that at 9:30 UK time, the Court of Arbitration for Sport would be making an announcement on the Manchester City appeal against the UEFA Club Financial Control Body sanctioning decision, which effectively banned Manchester City from the next 2 years worth of Champions League competition starting this next season coming up, and also fining the club £25 million, 30 million euros. And it was probably one of the most highly anticipated case decisions in an awful long time in the football community, simply because of the implications either way for what would have happened. So what I'm just going to do just for a couple of minutes is just quote very small particular details from the actual judgment, or rather the press release, the CAS press release. So at the moment, only the press release has been published. The award hasn't been published, i.e. the written reasons, all of the written reasons haven't been published. So I think at present, we can only speculate as to a lot of the detail, but there is some specific nuggets, some specific elements which are important to be able to go through that you can see from the CAS press release, and from specifically the UEFA press release as well. So let's go into a little bit of detail on that. So if I may, what I'm going to just try and do first is, I'm just going to change this light to make it a little bit over that way, is talk through the CAS media release. So you'll see in the press release, I've just got it up on screen now, and I'll just quote from it just very briefly. The main headline states that Manchester City did not disguise equity funding as sponsorship contributions, but did fail to cooperate with the UEFA authorities. So the ban has been removed completely, but there still is a €10 million fine that the club has to pay. Now, the interesting bit from the UEFA press release, rather the Court of Arbitration for Sport press release, is that the specific charges with regard to equity funding, disguised equity funding with regard to sponsorship contributions, the specific wording in relation to dishonest concealment of equity funding. Now, that to me sounds like a very high standard in order to for UEFA and the Club Financial Control Body to actually meet, which is one important thing, the dishonest concealment of equity funding, and whether that actual evidential level is actually applied. And I think the other part that I think is in the, no, it's not actually in the CAS media release, but is very much in the UEFA statement, which I'll just go to pretty quickly, where UEFA actually states that the CAS panel found that there was insufficient conclusive evidence to uphold all of the Club Financial Control Body's conclusions in this specific case, and that many of the alleged breaches were time barred due to the 5-year time period foreseen in the UEFA regulations. Now, the reason why I'm sort of stating a couple of those points is quite important, because in the CAS press release, we know, or we will know in the next few days, where the actual written reasons will be announced. The CAS press release says that the awards, just the decision, the written reasons will be published in the next few days. So we'll await with interest that, because that obviously is a very important part of the transparency now of the case, and I think it's likely we'll know a lot of detail very soon on that. But I think the two things that we can see is that CAS probably looked at this afresh, and they effectively stated that the high evidential threshold for dishonest concealment of commercial revenue, sponsorship revenues, wasn't met, and that even if it was, in a number of particular instances, matters were time barred, i.e. after a 5-year period. So there's certainly questions to be asked there about UEFA bringing a case and using evidence, and the club financial control body adjudicatory chamber. The adjudicatory chamber is effectively the first tribunal instance of a tribunal where UEFA, the independent body, ruled that Man City was in breach of the regs. So there's two probably elements there that are going to be very important to consider in the case, and we'll see those written reasons actually pretty shortly about what that was in relation to. So there are a couple of the bits that I wanted to flag, at least anyway. I think what I wanted to do also is then to start with the live chat questions, which hopefully will be of value. So I'm just going to move this a little bit so it's not in everybody's eye line. And where that leaves. So let's go on with just a couple of questions here, and we can see where we get to. So Dylan has asked a question: do you think City should have got banned overall? Because I got to just want to know a short answer. So Dylan, the short answer is we don't know if CAS has decided that City haven't dishonestly concealed sponsorship revenues, and that the only significant breach is a lack of cooperation, then the Court of Arbitration for Sport effectively said that shouldn't be the basis for a ban. So that's the basis there, is that a fine, a reduction for up to 10 million euros that needs to be paid pretty quickly by Man City is the basis for the punishment. Abdallah, the concept of FFP needs to be scrapped now. FFP was designed for cheapskating tight owners like United. Well, I'm not sure about that, and I think UEFA, the FFP regulations also need to be put in context, because I think as a much more wider and significant point, if the aim of the regulations was to increase the self-sustainability of football clubs, for clubs to live within their means and to spend rationally, etc., on the whole, that's actually happened. We've got a situation where club losses were reaching 1.7 billion euros back at 2010-11, where now clubs collectively, the ones that are playing in European competition, are making significant profit. Now, there's certainly a question mark over the enforceability of some of the regulations, now that we've seen PSG be successful in a particular technical challenge, which again is actually in relation to time limits and time periods by which a matter can go from the investigatory chamber to the adjudicatory chamber. And again, here it feels like Manchester City have won a significant victory, in part because of the challenge on the time limitation period, which under the FFP regulations appears to be 5 years. So I'm not of the view that FFP needs to be scrapped. I think there is going to have to be certain changes made, particularly and potentially bearing in mind some of the time limits that UEFA, in fact, have put in the regulations. But I'm not necessarily sure systemically that FFP is on its last legs. Sam, why didn't UEFA ban PSG? Is it because they bring in more money for them and are a bigger club? Well, it depends what for. If Sam, you're talking about, there's been two PSG matters. One was in 2014, UEFA entered into a settlement agreement at the same time actually as Man City in relation to particular breaches. And again, more recently, PSG effectively benefited from a time frame technicality of where if the investigatory chamber of UEFA didn't pass the matter on to the judicatory chamber, and the judicatory chamber didn't make a decision within a particular period of time, then they were out of time. And that was effectively the technicality that PSG went on, or rather were successful on. And I think, you know, those types of issues need to be borne in mind by UEFA for sure. So Farin, I think we've answered that question, which what does this mean for FFP? So NH, if the statute of limitation was a 5-year period from the offence period in question, which was 2014, then why did UEFA decide to go ahead with the judgment in 2020? Well, yeah, I don't know the answer at the moment. There's certainly a number of incredibly skillful, gifted lawyers for UEFA and City that would have argued that point. So I think for that, we've got to look and wait for the judgment and the decision, which will come out probably this week, to be able to talk through that particular point. Chirato, thanks for this. I wanted to know if with this decision, it's an alarm bell for FFP to be tinkered with, or FFP can still be called a success, quoting the profit and loss numbers of past years. Yeah, I think that's very much the point. I think, you know, UEFA might need a bit of a review of the regulations to understand if there are particular elements that can be amended. You know, ultimately, a lot of this most recent decision is due to the evidential thresholds, and whether actually there was enough evidence to be able to demonstrate that dishonest concealment. That seems, as I mentioned, a pretty high threshold to have been met. Courtney, do you believe that these types of proceedings should become more public or transparent? Yep, that's a great question. Now, I think there are a number of cases now before CAS which can be streamed, or the public can go and view particular matters, but they are a particular narrow category of fundamental rights issues rather than financial breach cases like in the FFP regulations. But I definitely think you're right in that, as will be the case here, that the written reasons at least will be available for everybody to be able to review and understand in a lot of detail, and that becomes a very important one. So if we go to Mazar, let's go to Jake, sorry. So does this verdict impact on the credibility of not only FFP, but UEFA? Yeah, I think we've talked about that a little bit, or touched on it. I'm not sure if it's the credibility, because I think UEFA would argue that it is their independent bodies, the investigatory chamber and the judicatory chamber, that is effectively deciding whether there have been breaches of the UEFA rules. And then it is for the CAS to review and decide whether they agree or disagree with those fundamental assessments being made. So I think obviously there's question marks over the sanctions, a very high-profile sanction against one of the most high-profile clubs. But again, it seems that some of those points are probably a bit narrower than a systemic fundamental issue with FFP. Matt, what impact do you think this will have on both UEFA's framework of FFP as well as domestic leagues such as the Premier League? Yeah, it's a little bit too early to say, and maybe that's a part of reason for doing the YouTube video today without seeing the written reasons. But again, I think you can gain little bits of information from the press releases which have come out, which is obviously UEFA's incredibly disappointed that particular evidence has been time barred, and that the evidential threshold hasn't been met in particular ways. But that doesn't necessarily mean an end to the FFP system as it is. I think there's certainly going to be question marks over how, for example, the case was run at CAS, because that's always usually the case with when one side loses. They have to look into the tactical acumen and the reasons why particular arguments were raised or not raised. But that's probably something for another day for UEFA to do. Dylan. So you're arguing that the thing is 10 million is nothing to them. It essentially means the end of FFP. Clubs can breach spending limits and get away with it, no point. Well, certainly your view. I'm not of that view. So Dylan, it's important to try and explain is that what actually the CAS has decided is that because it was alleged that Manchester City effectively through their owners funded commercial entities to subsidize the potential commercial revenues, that gave City more leeway to be able to spend. Now, it doesn't mean the end of FFP. It certainly doesn't mean the FFP. FFP is still there in its current guise. It may need changing in particular ways. But I can certainly see a lot of clubs not being particularly happy with the outcome, because ultimately the headline is that Manchester City at first instance were banned and are now reprieved. So without knowing the context, sometimes it can then seem that the system is necessarily broken, but we're talking about very specific, narrow grounds. Ivan, can Man City bring a case against the Spiegel for publishing confidential documents and correspondence? It's a great question. I don't know the answer for that. I'm not a defamation or libel lawyer, and I'm sure they've been looking into that for some time. So not sure about that one, but certainly a great question. Charles, do you think that eventually national governments will get fed up of UEFA and FIFA's inability to regulate such an important part of public culture? Well, yeah, that's quite a big one. Well, I'm not necessarily sure about that. I'm not necessarily sure FIFA, I mean, there are certainly issues and have been issues with FIFA over the years. UEFA, I think, has to be lauded in some respect, because they're the ones that have put their necks on the line to put in place a system to regulate club spending. It might not necessarily be that all the decisions always go their way, and it obviously hasn't in this case, but that doesn't necessarily fundamentally mean that the system is broken. I think, though, as I mentioned, there might need to be regulatory change if it's the particular time limits, if it's particular evidential thresholds, so that perhaps it's a slightly easier evidential threshold or burden to be able to get over, to be able to potentially prove breaches of the FFP regulations. Charles Jackson, does this illustrate the ineffective compliance assessments by UEFA? UEFA needs to show more credibility with more robust investigations and requires willingness of game meaningful disciplinary actions. Well, I'm not necessarily sure about ineffective compliance assessments. Ultimately, that the first body, the investigatory chamber, is investigating whether there are effectively potential breaches of the FFP regulations, and they considered that there were at the time. So if the consideration is that there were potential breaches, and that report then goes to the adjudicatory chamber, that adjudicatory chamber is then effectively adjudicating and coming to a decision, which it did originally do in order to ban Man City. That doesn't mean they're right, and obviously they haven't been in this case. And that's the reason for an appeal mechanism, an appeal body like CAS, to be able to appraise and reassess, and to make sure that ultimately that natural justice applies. So Sam's asking a question about best places to read certain cases and educate yourself. Yeah, there's some great ones out there. I would definitely go to, first instance, a great website called lawinsport.com. There's some great articles and cases there. Also, the UEFA and FIFA websites and CAS websites have a whole raft of great football and sports cases that I would recommend. Andrew's asked quite a broad question, which is this good for football? So yeah, it depends how you classify good, is the truth. Ultimately, my view is that it is an important procedural step to make sure that clubs, if they feel that they have been harshly done by, if they don't believe that they've been on the wrong side of a ban, that there is an appeal process at CAS to be able to rectify issues, just as Manchester City have said from the beginning. Now, I think a lot of people, stakeholders inside and outside the game, will argue that this isn't good for football because UEFA can't enforce their own regulations, and then what's the point of the regulations? But I think, as I mentioned already, it probably goes a little bit deeper than that. Firstly, because those UEFA points are very narrow breaches, and also because of the good that I think has brought for UEFA, effectively, really concentrating the minds of a myriad of clubs over almost a decade now to be able to become generally more self-financing, and ensure that those loss-making years can't continue. Got a question from Ramtin. Is CAS decision would help the development? This CAS decision, I'm not sure quite what you mean. Is the CAS decision would help the development of football overall? I think I've sort of answered that a little bit in the other way, where is this good for football? So probably not just going to repeat myself there a bit. Dave asked a question: does the fact that there hasn't been anything sanctioned against City's spending in recent years under Pep mean that's been deemed fair and legitimate from a FFP standpoint? Well, yeah, if the question there is that have there been instances over the last years, new matters where City have overspent, and that could lead to FFP breaches? My understanding is that there are no other pending investigations against Manchester City at the moment, which means what they've spent, they are allowed to have spent under the FFP regulations. Question from Siam Kelly: should FFP rigorously engage clubs that are debt run as it does with limiting owner capital injection? Yeah, it's a really good point, which is, the FFP regime is almost all to do with costs and revenues rather than debt. And there are a number of clubs across UEFA competition that still have significant debts. The question there is whether they can afford the capital and interest repayments, and that's something that obviously comes within the cost base on a yearly basis for the FFP assessments. But it was something that was considered in the beginning, and in the end, I believe at least that wasn't deemed the priority. Mazar: the reason I ask about an explanation on time barred is because the release also suggests Man City officials weren't sorry, I've lost you for a second, weren't cooperative with the investigation. Yeah, I mean, let's wait and see what the judgment actually says. I can't imagine that the time barred element kicks in, or would have been the case, should it not have been for the club's lack of cooperation. I wouldn't imagine that wrongdoing would have been a shield against that time bar. So there must have been a number of other issues which then fell outside of the 5-year limitation period. Charles Jackson's asked a good question. So the EFL has also shown ineffective and robustness. Governance appears poor and ineffective, and politicians raise concerns over sport's ability to regulate themselves. Member self-interest versus integrity of sport. I think I understand the point, Charles, but I think ultimately there's got to be a balance between how government is necessarily going to intervene or interfere with sport in particular ways. There has been recent EFL reviews of the owners and directors test regulations, of the takeover regulations, and you can see what's happening at the moment structurally with the potential of salary caps being imposed at the lower EFL levels. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be more robust takeover regulations brought in due course. But again, we'll wait and see on that. Raghav: Premier League investigations seem to be ongoing and do not have a time-barred barrier. What do you speculate with respect to this investigation? Yeah, it's a good precursor. I think at the moment, who knows on the Premier League investigation? There's barely been any publicity or any public comment from the Premier League or Manchester City on that. There is a regulation which specifically makes reference to whether there are where there are submissions made by a Premier League club to UEFA that somehow that UEFA is misled or misinformed about those particular submissions. So if Man City had been unsuccessful in their appeal, I think it would have been likely, I think it was regulation J7, that the Premier League would look to try and enforce that particular breach. Now, we don't know whether, as a result of that, the Premier League restrictions are quite a lot looser, whereas UEFA's FFP regulations are effectively acceptable deviations of 30 million euros over a 3-year period. The Premier League's is upwards of 105 million over a 3-year period. So the Premier League regs are a bit looser in that respect. So yeah, we'll wait and see. But if there is an investigation, if there is a tribunal occurring, or rather being sitting at the moment to be able to hear for those type of matters, then it's very quiet, and no one really has commented on that in the press, or there haven't been too many reports generally. Let's continue on. We've got a few more questions, I think. Simon Kelly again. So what is the rationale behind the use and reliance of evidence derived from football leagues in this particular case? It's a good question. It's a question really to do with admissibility of evidence. And we will see later in the week whether there were issues to do with admissibility of evidence. It might well have been that even though there were those football leaked documents, that UEFA still asked Manchester City to provide those documents, which they obviously thought that was in their possession, for then UEFA to be able to make an assessment on. So we don't know at the moment about the admissibility of particularly hacked documents, but I think all will likely come out in that in the written reasons later in the week. Charles Rose has asked, is it your belief that most clubs are actually taking FFP seriously and fairly, or do you think most are actually trying to get away with stuff, in inverted commas? Look, my own view generally is that there is a duty to cooperate. There's a duty of good faith on all clubs to cooperate with UEFA, and it looks like the vast majority are, simply because those that don't cooperate and those that act in good faith can potentially be charged under the FFP regulations. So I think the short answer is I don't know. I don't necessarily work with a lot of clubs on their FFP submissions, but I think at least the initial position has to be yes, is the answer. They are taking it seriously still. Question from Dave, almost at the end. So just a couple more questions if anybody has anything more. Why did UEFA prosecute knowing their rules had a time bar? Surely they knew their case would get thrown out at CAS as a result. Yep, we're gonna see in a few days on that particular point, because there will have to be, I presume, a particular point in the sand where the CAS have more or less said that any evidence from this day backwards would have been time barred for particular reasons based on particular rationale. So we'll wait and see on that point. So hopefully that's given you guys a little bit of an insight into what's happened today. I'll try and maybe do another YouTube explainer, perhaps once everybody's digested the written reasons, which are going to be very long, probably upwards of 100 pages or more, I'd have thought, because this is obviously going to be a very, very detailed assessment and explanation. Dominic mentions a good point. Will UEFA have to pay City's costs of making the appeal? That's a really good point. The fundamental practice usually is that the losing side pays. But again, we'll wait and see, because I know that based on the reports that were provided in the FT and others, that Man City assembled a pretty formidable legal team, which would have cost significant sums. So there's certainly a question over whether UEFA will have to pay all of Manchester City's costs or otherwise on this matter. So thanks everybody for joining. We're almost exactly at 30 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I managed to answer most of the questions. And please do share the link, tell people about the YouTube channel. Take a look at the channel as well for anything else that you might like. There's a whole course on football law and the football industry. There's a course about getting into the industry as well. So thanks for joining, and see everyone again soon.